Hello everyone, my name is Stephanie. Welcome to today's presentation. Hello, hi, welcome. While we're waiting for everyone to join today's meeting, we're going to recommend that to get the best viewing experience, you put your screen in side-by-side mode. So to do that, you head to the top of your screen. You will see a green notice that says you are viewing Niels's screen. Next to that, there is a drop-down menu called View Options. You click onto that and you head to the bottom and there is a side-by-side mode. Once you've clicked that, you should see the presentation come up on the left-hand side of your screen and all the videos come up on the right-hand side. Then you head to the top right-hand corner of your screen. You'll see an icon called Speaker View. If you click onto that, that'll give you just the main presenter's video. So right now you should just see my video come up on the right-hand side of your screen and the presentation on the left-hand side. Great. So we're going to get started with today's presentation. So Lpc Cresa is very pleased to be an American Chamber of Commerce member and to present and provide advice to AmCham members in relation to COVID-19 impacts on commercial leasing. So a few housekeeping things. If you would like to ask questions throughout the presentation, you can do so by opening the question and answer tab at the bottom of the screen. So if you head to the bottom of your screen, you will see a mute option, your video option, as well as a Q&A option. So if you click on that, that should open a separate window. And from there, you should be able to submit questions. There will be a designated question and answer time towards the end of the presentation. So feel free to submit those throughout, but we will be answering them towards the end. We would also like to let you know that today's presentation will be recorded. It's going to be made available on the LPC website, so that is lpc.com.au under Insights. We would also recommend that you head over there and subscribe to our newsletter to get regular updates on the COVID-19 legislation. So I'm going to hand over to John now to begin the presentation. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Stephanie, and welcome to everybody. I echo Stephanie's welcome, and thank you for attending today. This time will be beneficial for all tenants as tenants seek to navigate their way through the impacts of COVID-19 on the landlord-tenancy relationship. LPC represents tenants exclusively, and so our presentation is firmly from the perspective of the tenant in these negotiations with landlords. Now, the question that we're responding to today is a singular question. There are subcomponents, but it's a singular question. And the question is, what can a tenant do to contain occupancy costs during COVID-19? And also, what can a tenant do to get ready for post-COVID-19? We're finding increasingly that our tenants are starting to focus on the post-COVID realities of the current situation we find ourselves. Now, there's three aims in this presentation related to this question. And the aims are, firstly, to understand the COVID-19 context affecting commercial tenants and landlords. And secondly, to understand the fundamental changes to the rules of the game. And by the rules of the game, what game am I referring to? I'm referring to commercial leasing, the commercial leasing game. And then thirdly, to be better placed to act in relation to leasing arrangements, both interim and post-COVID-19. My role is to introduce the presentation and to create some context for the speakers that follow. So I will speak to the impacts generally of COVID-19 on commercial tenants, and then following that, Julian will speak to the more detail, followed by Michael and Carl and Rebecca. Michael will focus on the industrial clients or tenants. Carl will focus on retail tenants, And Rebecca will focus on getting premises ready for post-COVID-19. Now, the question would be, why is the beach scene in the background? It's a very visual communication of what we're currently dealing with, which we're dealing with a situation where tenants find themselves with, on the whole, limited utilization of premises that they are paying for via a leasing arrangement, and where tenants, on the whole, with few exceptions, are experiencing economic hardship in relation to the impacts of COVID-19 on their business. Not everybody, and the very platform that we're operating on, Zoom, would be an exception. Their businesses improve in the current situations. So that's the beach scene. So let's start with a poll. I'm going to hand back to Stephanie and start a poll to get everybody involved and on the same page.
Great, thanks, John. So I'm going to launch the poll now, and if you could take a few minutes to quickly fill that out, that would be great. So it should come up onto your screen in just a second. So the poll has been launched. That should be up on your screen now. And if you could quickly fill that out, that would be great.
Thank you, Stephanie.
So we are at 20%. We are now at 50%. 60%. 80%. So we're getting there, just a few more seconds now. %. Just the last few people filling out. And I'm going to close the poll in about 5 seconds. Okay, I'm closing the poll off now. Great, and I'm going to share the results with everyone, and then John will be speaking to those. So you should see the poll results on your screen now.
Thank you, Stephanie. So we can see by far and away, as everybody would expect, is the impact on utilisation is significant, and the vast majority of people are significantly impacted. You get exceptions, as I indicated. The organisation we're dealing with here, Zoom, might be an exception, but more significantly, things like aged care operators, retirement living, clearly they have to keep on using the facilities in the premises. Financial impact, even more dramatic, and that's been the government focus in their directives as they've tried to create a framework for negotiations between landlords and tenants. So thank you for that, Stephanie. Next slide, please. So I go back to the key question, summarize it even further, and the key question is COVID-19 has arrived, that's the context, and what do commercial tenants need in this context, a context that nobody has anticipated, and landlords and tenants have certainly not anticipated. Now, as tenant advisors, our focus is on what commercial tenants need in 2 phases. Number one, what commercial tenants need in response to COVID-19, firstly, in the interim, during the actual crisis. And that means what interim occupancy cost relief is required and sought. And then secondly, what the advice relates to the leases and premises that are fit for a post-COVID-19 situation, and the presenters will speak further to this. Well, we anticipate that post-COVID-19 will be a very different world for the relationship between tenants and landlord, and the considerations will be much changed to what they were before going into this crisis. Now, a few words about the context, the COVID-19 context, and the prefacing comment I'd make is that tenants are not getting what they signed up for, and landlords essentially are not offering what they intended to sign up for with the tenant. And I'll give a couple of examples. So both parties have got to a point where the intention of the parties is not reflected in the reality today. A couple of examples. You take a retail tenant, they would have signed into an agreement and engaged with the landlord on the basis of statistics being one of many considerations relating to foot traffic and various other considerations. And those statistics certainly don't hold today. Take an office tenant, where they would have signed up for an office of maybe 100, maybe 1,000 people, and they would have had a utilization based around considerations such as public transport and various other matters, and yet utilization is approaching nil in most instances today because of government directives, health considerations, and containing the virus actions that have been implemented. So those are examples really of the parties not getting what they've signed up for. Now, next slide, please. Now, the other thing I wanted to say before the other presenters speak to their particular areas is that tenants and landlords are stuck in a situation unwittingly, unwillingly, in which the context is evolving every day. The purpose of this slide, if you look at the dates at the bottom of each of those visuals, the one says 3rd of April, the other one says 7th of April, and then across on the bottom right-hand side, it's from our website, it's a pop-up, and it says receive our weekly COVID-19 updates for tenants. The important word is their weekly updates. This situation is evolving. There are some things that are certain, and my last slide will speak to what's certain, but it's evolving day by day. What is evolving? The depth and extent of the impact. You have a restaurant. Initially, they closed down the restaurant component and only had takeaways, and then it's moved on where many have closed down. An example of an evolving context for the tenant and the impact for the tenant. Evolving the government response. The government, first of all, gave general good behavior guidelines, how to negotiate, and then reinforced that with a mandatory code of conduct, which applies to specific organizations that fall into that framework. And then the depth and the extent of the stimulus has increased. It's just getting larger and larger each day. And that's significant because it means when you come to look at post-COVID arrangements, those are going to be very different to what they are today. Next slide, please. And so this slide actually changes the focus, and it says, what is actually certain? What are the things that we can bank on as tenants get through, and landlords get through, for that matter, the COVID crisis? These are the certain things. That unprecedented solutions will be called for and are being called for in terms of the arrangements between tenants and landlords, and unprecedented representation is called for in representing tenants in these particular situations, because the change of the rules have to be changes of rules which, in a sense, it's not the right word, but they favor the tenants. Those are the rules that have to be changed to enable the tenants to get through this situation. And so the next, those 3 points there, the ink is dry, now the ink is not dry. Lesser beware, replaced by lesser to share. Legal resolution being the general default for resolving matters between tenants and clients. Negotiated resolution being mandated, in fact, in this particular context. Thank you. Next slide. So time to present the rest of the speakers. Julian will focus on the office sector. Michael will, and he'll preface it for the rest of the speakers. Michael will focus on industrial, Kyle on retail, and then Rebecca will speak about the premises themselves. Thank you, Julian.
Thanks, John. So the 2 key things we're looking at is the immediate impact and then the long-term impact. And I'll be talking to the solutions around the limited utilisation of your premises from the permitted use under your leases, as well or combined with the financial hardship. And then from a longer term perspective, what are the impacts on the back of the accelerated adoption of mobile working? What will that do going forward? What changes in business requirements will there be post-COVID? And how will that feed into your lease or ongoing lease requirements and the premises requirements going forward? If we can go to the next slide, please. So this slide is around the key phases and key tasks to achieve the interim relief and the long-term post-COVID lease. So if we look at number one, negotiating the interim agreement, this is around the claim basis with the landlord. So if you're affected and you're unable to utilise your premises, which the majority of businesses are in, for example, we've got large businesses that are either, this is offices that have either closed their doors and removed access for their staff into the premises, or are operating at around 5 to 10%, which is really a fraction of the intended use. So the inability to utilise the space for what it's intended for, combined with financial hardship or impact, which is in two ways really. It's one is turnover and revenue has reduced on the back of COVID. And also what we're seeing is some parts of the business are, the costs have increased substantially. So healthcare and aged care providers, which rely on protective equipment, are seeing increases in the amount of 600% on some of those goods. So that's having an impact on the bottom line as well. So in terms of representation, what's important and what we're doing for our clients is ensuring that any claim is evidence-based. So this is not a profit-making exercise. This is ensuring that there's good evidence substantiating any claim with the landlord, and dealing with a landlord in a transparent way. And what I mean by that is setting up principles. So it's important to get the landlord on board with what is being proposed. And the key thing I'll say here is it's in relation to the principle of sharing that problem. We're paying for premises that we can't utilise, which is not the tenant's fault, not the landlord's fault, but it is a shared problem that needs to be dealt with. The negotiations around the interim solution are very much occurring now. If not, it started in March and we're expecting it to continue over the next couple of weeks, but it's something that we need to be getting onto ASAP. The post-COVID plan is looking at what are the business needs post-COVID-19. From a business perspective, what are the changes we're anticipating, and how does that feed into the leases and the premises? The obvious example is the working from home. How will that impact the space requirements? And Rebecca will talk a little bit more about the workplace a little bit later on. So, and again, that's something that we should be working on now over the next month or so that we are well and truly on our path to getting the leases and the premises fit for purpose post-COVID. So number 3 is effectively renegotiating with the landlord the post-COVID changes and restructuring the leases, as well as working on your fit out. And also bringing across some of the things from the interim solution, some principles around relief where there's a pandemic, and putting that into a lease going forward. Next slide, please. So what does a fair proportion in rent look like? And I think it's important to start with the end in mind here. And Stephen Covey has a great quote, which is, "To begin with the end in mind means to start with a clear understanding of your destination. It means to know where you're going so that you better understand where you are now, and so that the steps you take are always in the right direction." And if we look at Mr. Morrison's quote around the Commercial Tenancies Code, he was very clear about what is important as part of this code is that both parties negotiate in good faith. The turnover reduction of the tenant needs to be reflected in the rental waiver of the landlord. Now, we might just take a quick poll. Steph, if you wouldn't mind on the next slide, getting that poll up,
Yes.
just to get a sense of where we're up to in achieving the interim relief.
So the poll should be up on the attendee screens now. So if you could fill that out, just take a minute to do that, that'd be great. So we're at 5%. 15%. 60% now. So we'll just take a few more seconds. We're at about 70% now. Just getting those last few in. And I'll close the poll in about 5 seconds. Okay, I'm closing the poll now.
Thank you, Steph.
And the results should come up on your screen now, and Julian will speak to them.
Okay, so has your organisation achieved interim relief? So 75% have said no. Has your organisation made approaches to landlords? 70%, circa 70% of yes. And has your organisation made approaches to landlords for rent relief that has been rejected? About, say, circa 80%. So, which is consistent, and we'll talk to some of the reasons as to why that may be the case a little bit later. If we can go to the next slide, please, Steph. So this is a rating tool that we've put together, and apologies for the formatting, it seems to have changed a little bit. But what we wanted to highlight here is what we consider to be a favourable outcome versus a not so favourable outcome. And the key difference between the two is the favourable outcome contains a portion of rental that is waived, which is consistent with the government's announcement around commercial leases code, which, as you may be aware, is if you're eligible for the JobKeeper program, which is a revenue reduction of 30%, you're a company that has 50 million in revenue or less, you're entitled to the mandated code, which is currently going through the state governments, that effectively provides you a rental reduction equivalent to the reduction in turnover. And the point I'll make here is that a minimum of 50%, and I say a minimum of 50% of that rental reduction will be in the form of a waiver, which is not required to be repaid. So that's consistent with the favourable approach in our table here versus the not so favourable approach, which is a delay or a repayment plan that does not contain any waiver, and therefore not really a shared I guess a partnership or a sharing of the problem in relation to the premises. If we can go to the next slide, please. So how do we get there? So starting again with the end in mind, there's a couple of points here on how do we get to the interim solution. And obviously always important to keep the business needs in mind. But it's important to be structured. You want to know the basis for requiring relief and stating it clearly with the landlord. Getting quick and use a phased approach. And it's important that we substantiate the reduction in utilisation and also the claims, the financial impact or the turnover reduction. We need to be aware and expect that there will be some delays when discussing it with a landlord. Often they're asking for past financials, which is not relevant. So we're expecting them to push back on various fronts. And then we also need to be aware and expect that there's trade-offs that will not reflect the principle of sharing the problem. And as an example of that is a reduction in rent for 3 months in exchange for example, a 3-year extension to the lease, which is clearly not a reasonable outcome. If we receive negative responses, then It's always great to be able to point towards the Commercial Leases Code, which has been mentioned by the government now, or mandated, I should say, as the principles and the guidelines. And then we need to formalise the agreement, and obviously having regard that COVID will change, so we need to make sure we caveat that. But as I mentioned before, getting the principle right with a landlord is really the starting point to ensure that we can get to an appropriate outcome. If we go to the next slide, please. So in terms of post-COVID, how do we get there? It's ensuring that the business plan is reflected within the lease going forward, and the fit out, which Rebecca will mention. We need to negotiate early, so we need to get in there now and start having those discussions with a landlord in relation to what post-COVID will look like for you in terms of the leases. And we're anticipating there'll be some additional flexibility within the lease term. So, contraction rights especially, and if there's any large contracts that are tied to expiries, that we should look at tying those leases, potentially a contraction right into that lease for those contracts, and finalising any agreement and doing that quite quickly. I'll now hand over to Michael, who heads up our industrial division, who will focus on the industrial impacts of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Just wait for my video to start. Yes, sorry to emphasise that. Thank you, Julian. I'd just like to make a few points about the relevant to the industrial sector. Just the next slide, please. Just like the other sectors, those participating in the industrial sector have also been impacted. Of course, there are those that have been positively impacted as well, such as e-commerce operators and logistic providers due to the increase in online purchases. But many have been negatively impacted. Similar to the office, and as you'll find out in the retail sectors, there are two key areas of impact: utilisation or lack thereof, and financial hardship. Again, similar to the other sectors, there is a requirement for the landlord and tenant to share the pain in equitable proportions. I emphasise this is regardless of the size of the operations in our view. And finally, similar to the other sectors, industrial tenants need to rethink their business requirements, both now and post-COVID-19, so that they realign their property strategy accordingly. However, there are some specific nuances that are impacting the industrial sector. Apart from administrative and dedicated office-bound staff, operations can in many cases continue with vigilant social distancing, but this will come at a cost in terms of productivity and increased compliance. Some in the industrial sector, particularly in the construction and trade area, are seeing a surge in activity as projects are fast-tracked. But this is due to the uncertain economic climate. However, this surge is anticipated to stop and ultimately decline in the second and third quarters of this year and possibly beyond. Another impact is supply chain disruption. Excuse me. Australia is heavily reliant upon its trade partners in Asia, particularly China. These supply chains have been disrupted for obvious reasons, and importers and exporters are experiencing delays and tighter restrictions with provision of goods. In turn, this can impact the levels of inventory, which in turn can lead to underutilisation of a warehouse and manufacturing space. So, in summary, the industrial sector is really no different to the other sectors. The industrial tenant is being impacted both financially and through asset utilisation. And we stress the landlord is compelled to respond to that and share the pain. So, with that, I'll hand over to Kyle. I wanted to keep that as punchy and quick as possible. I'll hand over to Kyle Swain, Director of Retail, and he'll discuss the impacts on that sector. Thank you very much. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Michael. Also, quite quick rundown on the impacts on retail tenants, and I believe there's some retailers online today listening in, so hopefully a little bit of valuable information for you on the immediate and the long-term impacts COVID-19 will have on the sector. We're providing tenant rep solutions for retail tenants right now, have been for a number of weeks. I think the impact on retail was felt very early and was certainly the visual emphasis was from the start of COVID-19 was on the retail and what was happening in retail. Scott Morrison and the government's very early interventions was largely focused on retail because of the impact on the economy, the number of people employed in the sector, and the percent of GDP that retail accounts for. So the immediate impact obviously for retail tenants has been on turnover as government applied some interventions, particularly from March 22. We've seen impact on turnover from mid-March, March 22, when there was a requirement to close some businesses and to significantly impact on trade, as previously mentioned, with restaurants needing to close or to go to takeaway only, home delivery, etc. And a number of other retailers since that time have had to voluntarily close their businesses on both financial and health and safety grounds. So as of last week, there's been the mandatory code of practice come into place, and that's changed the game, particularly for the immediate intervention. We now have a set of mandatory guidelines and principles to abide by to achieve significant benefits for retailers with landlords. And that's split across, as John and Julian particularly mentioned earlier, both a waived component of rent and a deferred component of rent. We are pushing strongly for our tenants to get waived rent only because of the long-term impact of COVID-19 that we see, particularly on the retail sector, with reopening into potentially very poor conditions, conditions where modelling shows retail turnover could be as much as 50% depressed for a period of 12 to 18 months after COVID-19. The initial impact and the focus on rent relief right now is for the COVID-19 period, and that covers a period from April 3rd until such time as the government ceases the JobKeeper program. We're also very concerned with our tenants about the period after that, and you'll note in some of the correspondence around the mandatory guidelines, a period of recovery, reasonable recovery period after COVID-19. This is where we're working with our tenants to achieve agreements with landlords to switch to a turnover-based rent to assist during that period. And that could be a 6, 12, 18-month period. We believe that the impacts longer term will last for the full lease cycle. And then beyond that, the longer term solutions that we're looking at through the next lease cycle as well. So that's a very quick rundown on this short term, the immediate term, as well as going through this reasonable recovery period and for the remainder of the lease cycle. There's a lot of opportunity there for tenants to negotiate with their landlords, but there's also a lot, as we've seen from the poll, not many landlords have yet come to the party, and it is very much a negotiated outcome that we're looking for. With that, I might just hand over straight to Rebecca, our next speaker, and looking at the impacts on commercial tenants from and how project services can help with that. Cheers, Rebecca.
Thank you, Carl. So I thought that what we would discuss is that the need for post-COVID-19 to restate the business requirements and what that means with respect to the premises and the increased adoption of mobile working. So we might just go to the next slide though. I think we might just reflect on what the old norm was. So the old norm was focused on being present. Space was designed to support bumping into your colleagues, to support collaboration. A variety of spaces were designed to allow face-to-face team working. Tools were available to work remotely, but only adopted by a small part of the workforce. And this was often due to family arrangements or lifestyle choices. The current norm has shown that forced isolation has established remote and distributed workforces as a new norm. And in many industries, it's been very productive. Accelerated adoption, and this has led to the accelerated adoption of mobile working and the use of technology. So the new norm the pendulum will swing back, so it won't be as previously, and it probably won't be to the extreme we're experiencing, but there will be a new norm. And so what we're predicting is that the results of COVID-19, there will be sustained levels of unemployment. There will be continuing financial hardship, both personally and for organisations, and that some of the outcomes of this will mean that organisations or businesses will consolidate into spaces, that there will be mergers and acquisitions of businesses, and that management teams will be asking, why do we have all of this real estate and how can we save money? And real estate is, after staff costs, often one of the second largest costs for companies. So if we can go to the next slide, what we see is that the organisations will need to have smart strategies and solutions in order to be able to thrive in post-COVID. And so space optimisation strategies that rely on activity-based working, co-working or mobile working, and the increased uptake of collaborative technology will be at the fore. So spaces will be made to work harder, and this will mean increased utilisation and increased densities on floors. And there will be a need to amend and modify tenancies and workspaces to allow for this increased utilisation and increased density. We also see that offices will be closing, so there will be a need to make good premises to the pre-tenant standard of the base building, and we see that space will be handed back, and that will either be surrendering of premises, subleasing, or petitioning parts of floors back to make them available for lease. Other things that organisations will be looking into is, how can we make our people safe when they return to work, and what are the measures in place for that, and how can we use the space that we retain and have to reinvigorate and refresh the business moving forward. So John, can I just hand back to you now?
Certainly. Thank you, Rebecca. And so my role here is to just summarise and then to open up the Q&A. So in summary, from what everybody has said, interim occupancy cost relief, right from the beginning, the principle of shared pain, that's clearly in place. Exceptionally important to substantiate one's position as a tenant and not to be sort of knocked about in that regard. That's the Julian principle of the end in mind. And exceptionally important that the representation is skilled, evidence-based, substantiated, and the process has got substance to it. And then looking and to work towards principles that are useful in envisaging the post-COVID business. And so clearly look towards renegotiating, restructuring leases to fit post-COVID business requirements. And then, as Rebecca has spoken, think about premises, the rethink, the reshape and the refreshing of premises to fit post-COVID environments. It's interesting, before I go to Q&A, that just this morning, a client who does swimming pool construction indicated that on the commercial swimming pools, indicated they've never been busier. And I think the reason is that people have taken a view that people are not able to swim publicly, and now's the time to do work. And so there is this importance of rethinking premises requirements, getting on with it. Let's move to Q&A, and I'll hand back to Stephanie to see what questions have come through.
Great. So the first question we have is from Brenton, and he says, we temporarily closed our store last Saturday due to COVID-19, but our online store continues to operate. When calculating our percentage reduction in turnover, do we include the online store? I'm going to hand over to Kyle to answer that one.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, this is a great question, Brenton, and actually it's different in each state. The online sales component hasn't been built into the legislation in every state as yet. Certainly in New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, we can remove online sales from the gross sales calculation each month, providing the stock is not collected from the store when ordered online, or picked and packed from the store location and sent out to the customer. Even in New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, if that's the case, then those sales are required to be included in the gross sales. In your situation, I believe you're in South Australia, and that's a little different. It's still silent on that exact situation. So our recommendation in that case would be that what we're really dealing with is the bricks and mortar retail environment, and we would be seeking to provide comparative data from bricks and mortar sales from the comparative period, either last month or the same month last year, compared to the COVID-19 period. That would be our suggestion going forward for anybody who's in that situation. And many are, because many have adapted quite quickly to include online sales. Food and beverage retailers, one of our clients has had to revert to home delivery and takeaway sales only, where they would normally be a retailer where people come and sit and eat food. So that's our recommendation there, Brenton, for South Australia specifically as well.
Great, thanks, Kyle. So the second question we have is anonymous. Anonymous says, my organisation is an industrial firm with over 50 million in turnover. We expect there to be a time lag in the impact of COVID-19 in our business. Does this disqualify our firm from getting rental relief? So does someone from our panel want to answer that one?
But perhaps I will, Steph, given it's an industrial client or company. The short response to that is no. Despite the fact that you might be under 50 million and that you don't have an immediate impact, the answer is a definite no. The principles, and this is what we've been trying to stress, is that the principles are, and these have been mandated by government, the principles are that the pain be shared amongst the landlord and tenant. And someone needs to intervene between the landlord and tenant to be able to make that happen. In terms of the lag, that is something that is as I alluded to in my short presentation, is that the lag is something that is quite prevalent in the industrial arena. Indeed, some of our clients which are in the construction materials space have seen a considerable spike in their activity as a result of organisations wanting to get projects done, because there's so much uncertainty about what the future may hold. But they are also forecasting that will spike, and the second and third quarter, and as I suggested again, possibly into the new year of 2021, that will fall off. That will fall off. So the response is that you should act now. You should be putting your landlord on notice, and you should be structuring your arrangements both formally in the form of a lease, and also how your premises may look. You should be responding to that now to ensure that that it is taken into account once that downturn does eventuate. Anybody else?
No, great answer.
Great. Thanks, Michael. So we have another anonymous question. Anonymous asks, from a commercial tenancy perspective, how does the commercial leases code apply to a tenant utilising the serviced office space under a long-term contract? Do the same principles apply? John, would you like? Yeah.
Maybe that's one I can answer. Look, even though you may not form part of the mandatory code, commercial leases code, again, to Michael's comment, the principle still applies. If you're unable to utilise that space for its intended purpose, it deserves a conversation with the landlord, a conversation around a rental waiver. And we strongly urge you to, that's something that needs to happen. So the principles still apply, in short.
And that question, if I may add, that question related to serviced office, was it?
Correct.
Okay. So what I would add to that is it's the question of utility as well. Very often serviced office arrangements have got a virtual component to them in terms of reception and various other services. And so those services might still be in place. So being judicious, it's sort of working out what level of utility and hardship has been experienced, what negative impact on utility and hardship.
Great. The next question we have is another anonymous. There has only been direction on franchises and retail group in terms of the $50 million limit. Do you know what applies in subsidiaries versus the corporate group in non-retail sectors? Is the 50 million on a subsidiary level similar to the ASIC requirements?
Can you read that again?
Sure. There has only been direction on franchises and retail groups in terms of $50 million limits. Do you know what applies in subsidiary versus corporate group in non-retail sectors? Is the 50 million on subsidiary level similar to the ASIC requirements?
I'll bet you, Carl, you go ahead, Carl.
There you go. Thank you. Just an important point there, that the Code of Conduct came out and used that example to distinguish between a franchise group and a group level, but that doesn't mean that it's restricted to only that example. So from there, perhaps Julian or John could pick that up. That was an example of two different ways to look at the Code of Conduct applying in the retail sector.
Thank you, Carl. So what I would say is what's extremely important is that the mandatory code, the government's thrust has been on protecting jobs and on protecting small business, because that's the broader economy and the context. But the principles, if you think through the presentation here and the best we've done in the short time available, is the principle is that the principle is that one of shared pain, regardless of the size of the entity. Michael made this point in his presentation. The principle is one of shared pain of getting through this COVID-19. And so I think we can use the expression that it absolutely requires a conversation. Don't be bound by this 50 million and the various constraints. What the government is doing there is they've created the principle, which is good faith negotiations, which is sharing the pain of the impact on the tenant's business. That's the principle. We would go further and say you've got to deal with utilisation as well. And then there needs to be a good, strong, good faith negotiation regardless of the size of the operation.
Great.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know if Julian had something further to say on that. I'm not sure.
No, I think you've summed it up well. It's any organisation. It's just mandated for companies that are eligible for JobKeeper program and 50 million revenue and below.
Essentially what the code does is the code makes it more difficult to, if I could use the phrase, to not do the right thing for those who fall within that. But the principle applies to every tenant, commercial tenant landlord relationship, whatever the size.
Great, and we'll just do one last question. There are quite a few submissions here, so if your question wasn't answered, please feel free to email LPC directly. The email address will be on the slide at the end if you would like your questions answered.
Can I just say, Steph, what we will do is take those questions, regard them all as anonymous, and also in relation to what we post for this is we'll answer those questions as best we can.
Great. So just the final question is, apart from rental relief, is it fair to ask the landlord for a reduction in operating expenses for a building?
Great question.
Perhaps I can answer that one. So what the conversations we've been having with landlords is on two fronts. One is the operating expenses for the building, and then the operating expenses for the premises specifically. Given that the buildings, in terms of office buildings, are sitting at around 5% occupancy, it makes a lot of sense for the services to be reduced accordingly, and therefore the outgoings or the ongoing running costs reduced for the tenants, and that being passed through directly. There's also discussions around land tax relief from state governments, which would come through on the operating expenses as well. And then on a specific premises basis, again, if premises are only being occupied at 5 or 10%, then there's a whole heap of things that we don't need, whether it's plant hire, cleaning internal glass, and all those things can reduce now in order to have some savings.
Great. Okay, so that concludes the Q&A for today. So thank you very much for attending today's presentation. We want to say a special thank you to AmCham for facilitating this presentation, and to our members and guests. Please visit the AmCham website for future events, and make sure to head over to the lpc.com.au website to sign up for the weekly newsletters to receive updates on the COVID-19 legislation. The recording of today's presentation will be made available on the LPC website under Insights, which you can see on the presentation slide. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists. Bye.